Good morning, everyone. I hope your weekend went well. And today we're going to start talking about our first topic. We'll begin our series of lectures after talking about just introducing everything on our class on Wednesday. So let me share my screen with you. There it is. And um, okay, so a couple of points before I begin talking specifically about today. As you saw before I put the slides on the screen, uh, I I placed a nice background behind me instead of just having the background of my office, which is not very interesting. If you are interested in having a picture of any place that you really like, your pets, your favorite sports team, or whatever that you want me to place them in the back when I'm recording those lectures, you're more than welcome to email them to me, and I will do that. Previous semesters, when I did that, I had a lot of pictures of different pets, different places that you've uh, been around here in the US or around the world, places that we would like to go back to, or your pets, or your sports teams, or whatever. But if you're interested in that, you're more than welcome to send that to me. That's number one. In terms of how the lectures are going to go from today moving forward. So this is a slide that I'm going to have in any of the lectures moving forward. When I'll begin talking about the topic, before I begin talking about the topic, I will start by doing a quick review on what was the main issues that we talked about in the previous meeting. So for today, on the last meeting, we covered the syllabus. I talked at length about the syllabus, the different course procedures, and I introduced you to different tasks you're gonna have to complete during the semester and all the relevant things about the course that are on the syllabus, of course. And then I talked a little bit based on the podcast episode by Professor POLS. What exactly is IR research? Why are we engaging that? Why are we developing theoretical explanations to events that happen in the world? And we'll talk a lot more about those issues today. So that's a quick review on Wednesday. The other thing that is added to the slides from this day until the end of the semester is I have a quick jumping point here, and that's going to be the last slide you're going to have in every one of those lectures, and those are recommended readings. For whatever topic I'm going to talk about, if you're interested in reading more, in learning more, then I'm going to list you about 2 or 3 in each lecture. You're welcome to go look for those and read them. Of course, they're not required, they're only recommended, and they can also be useful once you get to that point of writing your different tasks for this course. So this is something else you're going to start having on your slides from this day forward. If you have any questions, as always, email me, send me messages on the Canvas or whatever method is easier for you. Of course, office hours. And as you remember, we have our Friday discussion meeting. Starting this Friday, we'll have those discussion meetings every week for the remaining of the semester. One final thing, I promised I'm gonna let you know once the website is gonna be up and running. So he's almost ready. I hope by Wednesday that it's gonna be ready. It's gonna provide you mostly with easier access to the slides and to the lectures once I upload them. And you just can go to the website and then get the links from there, go straight away to those kinds of things. So I hope to get it by Wednesday. Once I have the website ready, I'm going to email you the link for that. And that's going to be updated after every lecture day with the relevant material. Okay, so let's start. Our first topic will be a general discussion, or actually an introduction into the basics of theories. What are they? What are those theories? What are the main components of the theory? And how do we judge a theory? I will address all those questions in many details and offer you multiple examples when it really comes to international relations. So let's start with the first question. Why do we need theories? The most straightforward answer for that is that we want to understand events, we want to understand past events, we want to understand current events. For example, we want to learn why did World War I begin? What led to the establishment of an organization such as NATO? Why did the Soviets decide to invade Afghanistan way back in 1979? So we can do that by looking at the past and learn from that and think about whether similar events can happen in the future. However, we cannot solely rely on events that happened in the past in order to explain what may happen in the future. And this is very important also for understanding current events. Facts, which is actually historical events that happened in the past, those past events, we can view them as facts. They are a crucial part of any explanation we're trying to provide to those kinds of events, but they do not explain the events by themselves. They serve as evidence for the explanation. When we're trying to explain why do wars between big countries begin, we're providing a theoretical explanation, clear explanations with different components, and then we can use those facts, those past wars that happened in the past, as evidence to test those explanations, right? So past events or the facts are part of the explanation. They're not the explanation by themselves. We can think about that as distinguishing between theory and history. History provides us with a descriptive explanation of past events. If we're thinking about why did the Soviets invade Afghanistan, we can look at this specific case and we can explain what happened and what led to the invasion at the time. On the other hand, theory will offer us a prospective explanation to a classes of events. So we're not just looking at why the Soviets invade Afghanistan, looking at why large countries invade other types of countries, and not just explaining this specific case, the Soviets in Afghanistan, but explaining cases that may happen in the future. How can we explain or how can we predict if large countries are more likely or less likely to invade other countries in the future? That's the main way that we can distinguish between history, which has a lot of facts in it, and theory, which is the explanation for those events. Okay, now theories are, as our friend Oprah has told us, not just for academics or aspiring academics like myself or long-suffering students like yourself. Policymakers also use theories. Policymakers need to make a large amount of decisions based on uncertain reality in which they don't really have all the facts. What they do is that they are having different types of competing explanations. So whenever events they're facing, there's different explanations to this event. What we can use that for our terminology, we can think about as different theories to explain those situations. And then they use whatever information they already have in order to test those explanations and see which one of them fits with reality, with what they actually face. Now, this is a descriptive way to talk about it. Let's look at a specific example. Say goodbye to Oprah for now. Our example will be the Iranian nuclear program that has been in development over the last almost 30 years for now. Now, one of the main research questions we can devise for that is the Iranian nuclear program. Is it developed for military usage or for civilian usage? So let's go back again to what I just talked about, the difference between facts and theory, and begin with the facts. What do we already know? We know that over the last 20 years and more, Iran has been building secret underground nuclear facilities for nuclear research to develop nuclear energy. We know that Iran has already developed thousands of centrifuge and has been engaged in enriching uranium, which are both components of developing this kind of technology. At the same time, another historical fact that we know is that the Iranian religious leadership in the past has declared what's called the fatwa, which is a religious decree, which rejects the use of nuclear weapons. Those are all historical facts that we're familiar with. Now we'll move to the next section. So this is history. Now we're looking at theory. What are some of the potential explanations for the Iranian development of nuclear technology? One potential explanation, if we assume that the leadership in Iran views the application of nuclear weapons as a way to expand its regional power and to deter adversaries such as the United States or Israel for that matter, then it makes sense that the development of nuclear technology is intended for military usage. That's one potential explanation. Another potential explanation is if we rely on the religious beliefs of the leadership, which believes that heaven is going to wait for those that martyr themselves by destroying their enemies. So if the Iranian leadership is going to lead a war using nuclear weapons against Israel as an adversary and destroy it, and they may die also, but they will arrive in heaven, which is a religious belief, some form of interpretation of the Islamic religious belief, which we're not going to go into. But if we assume that that is true, then again, it makes sense for Iran to develop nuclear technology for weapons usage. At the same time, it's also possible that we can provide another explanation, for that matter, that Iran is interested in developing nuclear technology for civilian usage in order to supplant its already ending energy shortages. Energy shortages, which are mostly because a lot of the energy oil that Iran has is used for export in order to support the economy. So nuclear technology in that case is going to be used for civilian usage. Those are just different types of explanations. Now, if we go back to policymakers, they will use different types of information. In this case, they're going to have that information from intelligence and national security agencies, and they will test those type of potential explanations, identify which one of them is not consistent with the information or with the facts that they already have. So for example, if our intelligence community, intelligence agencies has been able to provide evidence for our policymakers that Iran has been testing a nuclear bomb trigger, which is an essential component in the development of a small nuclear device, then that's going to fit with the theory that Iran is using nuclear weapons for military usage, whether it is as a deterrent or whether it is based on the religious explanation. We don't know which one of them it fits necessarily, but we know for sure, based on that information, that it does not fit with the civilian usage explanation. Because if Iran has developed nuclear bomb trigger, they're not going to use the nuclear technology for civilian usage. So this is one thing that we can do with this information. We can rule out potential explanation that exists. So essentially what we just did here as an example is that we use a structured set of rules, in this case scientific rules, to learn of the way to assess competing explanation using existing evidence and to arrive at some kind of conclusion about what is the potential explanation to the event that we have at stake. Understanding this kind of structure of inquiry is a very first important step in understanding reality. And if you're looking for one general objective that I would hope you would gain from this course, if you want just one, is that how to properly apply the scientific method in order to understand international events, right? All right, so this was our background. So now we know why theories are important for people, not just for academics, but other people as well. As we go into understanding the idea of constructing a theory, I want to take a step back and think about some definitions and the building blocks of theories. So a theory is a simplified representation of reality, is intended to explain some empirical phenomena. For example, what are the conditions that lead to the beginning of a preventative war? What condition encourage economic prosperity? What discourage economic prosperity? This is why we have theories. For us, we're studying, of course, the social sciences. So those are the kind of examples we just talked about. But this definition of a theory, like thinking about it in the context of a simplified representation of reality that's intended to explain an empirical phenomena, also fits with the natural sciences. In this case, physics, astrophysics, whatever those other kind of disciplines are, they are intended to specify the multiple conditions that exist that will explain what explains the motion of stars, what explains the motion of planets, what leads to changes in weather patterns. So the idea behind what do we do with a theory, what is a theory, is correct for social sciences as well as for the hard sciences or the natural sciences. What both of those types of categories trying to do, what we also try to do, the same thing, just like natural sciences try to do, is to build a theory, which is what's called a deductive theory. It is to build a general explanation for some phenomena that we can then apply to a class of specific cases. So we want to explain what are the conditions that lead to the beginning of a preventative war. This is our general phenomena. And then we can apply that to a preventative war between the United States and Canada, between Mexico and Brazil, or between South Africa and Morocco, whatever, right? That's the idea behind building a deductive theory. So we're trying to build a general theory that explains this general phenomena, and then we can apply that more specifically. All right, so what are the different components of theory that we have? We have three fundamental components: assumptions, logic, and prediction. I'm gonna go over them. I wanna begin with assumptions, of course, a critical building block of a theory. These are a set of simplifying conditions that's gonna help our theory to explain the issue at stake and also offer future predictions. As we said, one difference between theory and history is that theory can also explain or predict future events. So assumptions in this case are essential. The main role, one of the most important roles that assumptions play is they help us in simplifying reality. Instead of looking at all the moving parts that are working in order to explain reality, which is very complicated in many cases, we're using those assumptions to simplify reality in order to provide a much clearer explanation to the phenomena that we're studying. At the same time, there's a cost for that because that limits our view. There's some aspects that we cannot account for when we're simplifying reality. And I'll get to an example in a few seconds, and then it's going to make it a little bit clear. Assumptions are usually go together based on, we have to provide some logic to explain how those assumptions are working together, and those will derive our hypothesis, our predictions. Those hypotheses represent these theories' explanation of the reality that we're studying. We're deriving those hypotheses. Now, the selection of assumption is critical, mostly because different scholars, different investigators will build their theoretical explanations for whatever topic it is that they're studying based on what they believe are the assumptions that best reflect the events. Let's look as an example for that and understand it, because what does that actually mean is that the assumptions that I'm going to rely on to explain some events may not necessarily be the same assumptions that another scholar is going to use to explain the same event. So what we get eventually are different theories that explain the same event, the same phenomenon. Let's take an example for that. What I have here for you are two different theories. Both of them we're going to talk about on some level during the course. The first one is the neorealist theory, which we're going to talk about next week. Now, regardless of what the theory is, it's an explanation for how the international system operates and how that leads to the behavior of different states. But for the discussion today, a central assumption of the neorealist theory is that states are unitary actors. What does that mean? That means that any internal conflicts between decision makers within a state do not influence the actions that the states eventually execute in the international system. So if the United States decides to provide foreign aid to Kenya, it doesn't matter if there is any kind of conflict of opinion between the president and Congress or the president and members of the cabinet. It doesn't matter for the neorealist theory. The assumption is that everybody agreed on that level of foreign aid to Kenya because that's what we see in the international system. A different type of theory is the bureaucratic theory. In this case, what are the central assumption of that theory is that the actions of the state are based on the internal dynamic of bureaucracies and the desire of each one of those bureaucracies to promote their own mission. And so this is actually the exact opposite of the unitary actor assumption, because in that case, if we stick with the example of the foreign aid to Kenya, the US decision to provide some level of foreign aid to Kenya is the end of an internal bargaining, in this case, or dynamics between Congress and the president and members of his cabinet and members of his staff, each one of them trying to pull to their own direction. Eventually, it settles for some kind of eventual outcome. But those are the internal potential conflicts of interest between sides that leads to this outcome. So those are two different theories which rely on two very different set of assumptions, and we're trying to explain the same thing. So let's look at a more clear example for that fits to our, and we want to explain military spending. That means how much money we're spending on our military forces and how that shapes the behavior in the international system. So how can each one of those theories, the neorealism versus the bureaucratic theory, explain that based on its own assumptions? So if we start with the bureaucratic theory will argue that the extent of spending on military is a function of the perception of different military leaders or military agencies that's going to manipulate those threat perception in order to increase the defense budgets for their own organization. So in that case, the extent of spending the United States will place on its military for 2021, just as an example, a general from the US Army will say that most of the threats are actually engaged in land forces. So we have to invest a lot more money in the US Army, in the land forces of the US Army. On the other hand, a general from the Air Force will say a lot of the threats are much higher when it comes to using Air Force. So we have to invest a lot of money in technology and weapons for the Air Force. So eventually, the extent of spending will be dependent upon the eventual negotiation or interaction between those types of agencies. On the other hand, if we're looking at the neorealist perception in this case, is going to reject the view of any kind of internal dynamics between those different agencies, and they will rely that the extent of military spending the United States has on its military for 2021 is based on a more unitary perception of threat. All members of the armed forces has the same perception of the threat, and those are the interests of the state. So there's some kind of a required spending on security that the US has to do, and it doesn't matter how we got to that. So that means what this example provides us is telling us that when scholars choose their assumptions, whatever it is, in this case, the example I just gave you, neorealism and bureaucratic theories, they also have to understand whether these assumptions limit the domain or the circumstances that their theory can address. Because if I'm following the neorealist assumption, the neorealist theory to explain military spending, I cannot provide additional details about how kind of any kind of an internal dynamic led to that, because it's not part of my theoretical explanation. Right? So this is the importance of assumptions in this case. All right. So we will talk about a lot of different theories in this course, but in order to make theories valid, we have to be able to test them empirically. And for that, I want to link the discussion that I had so far with some more specific aspects about testing theories from an empirical standpoint. So let's start from the basics. Theories describe relationship between variables. A changes in X leads to a changes in Y. So, and that's exactly what I'm talking about here. Variables are characteristics or events that can have multiple values. If we go back to military spending, so if our variable is military spending, it can be any number between whatever number we start from, 10 million all the way through $10 trillion. So there's multiple values for variables. At the same time, we can also have a constant. A constant is a characteristic or an event which has a single value. How much money did the US spend on its military last year, 2020? That's a constant in this case. The dependent variable is what we want to explain. If we want to explain, again, coming back to our last example, military spending, then this is our dependent variable. We want to explain how the extent of spending on the military will change. And how do we do that? We do that with the independent variable, is what are the set of factors that we use to explain the variation in our dependent variable. Military spending in the United States is changing every year. So it varies every year. And we want to use different independent variables to explain why does it vary. How do those different variables work together? We link those variables and try to establish a causal relationship between the dependent variables and the independent variables. We don't want to just show that a change or something that happens in one independent variable also happened in the same dependent variable, because this is one of the differences between correlation and causation, which we'll get to it. But we want to show how changes in our independent variable X has led to changes in our independent variable Y in this case. So we derive our expectations about this relationship in a series of logically connected arguments. How we have to explain how the changes in our independent variable led to the changes in our dependent variable. And this way we derive what's called hypotheses or propositions, which again describes some form of relationship between the independent variable, how their changes lead to variations in the dependent variable. And those hypotheses are the basis for predicting the values of the dependent variables in past, when we're studying past events, as well as, even more importantly, in the future. Let's, in order to make all this discussion about linking variables and how they lead to different outcomes and how they lead to different propositions clear, again, let's use an example. What we're going to talk about in this example is arms races in war. How can we explain the relationship between arms races, investing in military spending, and increasing the extent of arms to the likelihood that a war will erupt? All right, so again, we're talking about variables, so let's look at the variables. Our main dependent variable in this case is the likelihood that the country is going to enter a war. So I'm not looking at just what's the likelihood the United States is going to go to war with Canada. We're looking at a more and we're looking at a variable that's going to allow us to look at multiple countries and not a specific event. What's the likelihood that any country is going to enter a war? That's our dependent variable. And the variation in this case is the likelihood can range anywhere between 0 to 100 for that matter. It can also be over yes or no. It's also a possibility. That depends how do we want to measure our likelihood. But that's our dependent variable. what are some of the potential or the common independent variables, factors that's going to explain whether a country is going to go to war or no? One possibility is to use the magnitude of the threat, which is how much we think that our adversaries represent a threat to us. There's different ways we can measure magnitude of threat. For example, the extent of arms expenditure by the adversary. So if we're looking at, I'm here in the United States, and we observe Canada over the last 2 or 3 years has increased its arms expenditure by over 25%. In a way, that represents a threat to the United States. Why? Because Canada is now much stronger from a military standpoint. So that's a higher perception of threat for the United States. So that's one way to measure. There's a lot of ways to measure that. That's just one example. Another independent variable that we use to explain our dependent variable is what's called the guns versus butter ratio. In this case, this is the domestic demand for consumer goods and services versus the defense expenditure, which essentially says how much do the population, the citizens, prefer the government to invest its budget in the domestic economy versus investing a lot of the budget in national security. Essentially, that's what it says. So one potential proposition based on linking those different variables is that increases in the perception of the threat combined with decreases in the demand for consuming goods and services, both of those together increase the likelihood of war. So what we did here is that we took one combination of those common independent variables, right, higher degrees of threat, and focus on the guns in this ratio, and that increases the likelihood of our dependent variable, war is more likely. And this is essentially what Richardson did in his paper way back in the late 1940s in order to explain how those different factors, which are related to arms race on some level also, lead to wars. All right, so this is just an example in order to show you how those variables are working together. Okay, a few more points about the construction of theories. What we're trying to do is to build general theories, just like this guy. This guy also had a theory, a pretty important one. However, in the vast majority of cases, especially for us in social sciences, we have to settle for what's called middle range theories. Those theories provide plausible explanation for a certain class or a certain cluster of events. It's very hard to derive a general theory that explains all types of events that fit to our phenomenon. So we're thinking about, let's go back again about wars. Derive a general theory about wars is very, very hard because it's going to be a lot harder to specify all the conditions that explain both wars between small states and wars between large states and wars over territory and wars over the economy. That means we're going to have to rely on a lot of assumptions and conditions in order to derive that general theory. So instead, what we're doing is that we're building middle range theory, which offers us this point that I have here, which is the principle of parsimony. The idea of principle of parsimony is that we want to derive a clear explanation. It's going to cover a lot of cases, but it's going to be based on a limited set of assumptions because it's simpler and it's clear. So instead of trying, as I just said, to build a theory of war which has to cover all types of wars, instead we're building a middle range theory about nuclear wars. We're building a theory about low-cost wars. We're building a theory about proxy wars, or we're building a theory about wars between small states, because then we can rely on a much smaller number of assumptions, and it's still going to cover a lot of cases. And our explanation eventually is going to be much clearer. That's the idea that we're going to do. All right? So that's in terms of theory construction. Okay, now, please, let's use Mr. Nissen here in order for me to highlight the next point. As I said on the lecture on Wednesday, and as you have on a syllabus, the way that I'm going to measure attendance for this semester is by pausing the lecture at some point and giving you some kind of term of a word, which will be the attendance word for today. So that's what I'm going to do now. Starting from now, in every lecture I'm going to stop at some point. Not always I'm going to have the picture of Liam Neeson in the back, so you have to pay attention to that. So for today, the attention word of today will be the word spring, as in spring semester. So again, a quick reminder what you need to do now. Finish listening to this lecture. Once you're done, you go to the attendance form. You can click the link on the syllabus or the one I sent you. And in that form, you have to plug in all your personal information, your name, your UIN, the date of today, Monday, with the date of the lecture, and then plug in that word spring, and that's going to keep your attendance for today. Okay, and that's how we're going to move forward from today till the rest of the semester. All right, so now we have learned already how to construct theories, or what are the main aspects that we have to think about when we're building our theories. I want to move on to the next phase, which is how do we evaluate a theory? How do we know that a theory is actually good in explaining the thing we're trying to explain? So 3 elements are part of the evaluation criteria. The first is evidence. We need to have evidence that either supports or contradicts our predictions. Second is we need to ensure we have logical consistency among the theory's assumption, which means logical consistency for the theory itself. And third, we want to show that our theory will outperform any alternative explanation that we have for that specific phenomenon. That's the way we're going to evaluate the theory. So let's talk about each one of those criteria. The first one is pretty straightforward. Now we can see it's pretty straightforward, and that's evidence. If we don't have evidence that either supports or contradicts our theory, then it's not very useful because we cannot really know what this theory is all about. As an example, there's theory that talks about the relationship between territorial disputes and the likelihood of interstate wars. So the prediction of that specific theory is that whenever 2 countries or more are engaged in a dispute which revolves around territory, then the likelihood that those 2 countries or more than 2 countries will go into war is much higher. Now, the evidence in this case shows that the likelihood of wars is much higher when the issue at stake is territory. There's a lot of studies that show that. So essentially, the evidence we have for that specific theory shows that the theory is correct, that the links between territorial disputes and war are positive. So that's a pretty simple way. The data supports our theoretical propositions. All right, now, the second point is logical consistency. Logical consistency means that the theory must clearly describe how one set of factors will cause another set of factors. It also means that the assumption of the theory cannot contradict one another. Okay, we need to describe how different set of factors, if we took the examples from the previous slide, how do disputes over territory, how they lead to the outcome of wars. A very clear description of those connections. Now, also we need that our assumptions for our theory in question will not contradict one another, because if the assumptions contradict one another, then it makes it much harder for us to predict how those events also may happen in the future, right? Let's take an example for that also. Next week, we're going to talk about the theory of realism, which explains, again, it's a system theory which explains how different conditions within the international system leads to the behavior of different states in the international system. And one of the central assumptions of realism is the importance of power as one of the central components of how states behave toward each other. States are mostly focusing on expending their own power in the international system. At the same time, even though this is one of the most important assumptions that guide the theory and explain the behavior of states, there's also an internal contradiction in that theory. On the one hand, states or nations seek to expand their power at any cost. That's a very basic assumption of realism. At the same time, realism also describes an additional type or class of countries which are described as status quo states. Status quo states are content with the current situation and do not pursue more power. So that means we have here 2 different assumptions that are opposite to one another, which makes it very harder for us to predict how states will behave. If the behavior of state, does it fit better for the expansion of power or the satisfactory, with the status quo? One way we can, in a way, resolve that kind of problem is to focus on one side of this kind of conditions. If we're focusing on the assumption of seeking power by states in the international system, that's going to help us to explain and then predict states that behave in an imperialistic strategies, an imperialistic approach to international relations. That because those kind of states are seeking to expand their power at all costs. They're trying to change the distribution of power in the system for their favor. But the problem, again, if we're focusing on that side of the assumption, is that will not allow us to explain states that behave focused on the status quo. These are one of the significant problems of the realist theories, and they're very serious, especially with the applying the theory of realism to reality. And overall, if we go a little bit expand beyond the realist theory and look overall in the social sciences, logical consistency is very difficult to implement in social science setting, because we need to find multiple cases which are similar in order to test our theory. And this is very, very hard. Also, we need to ensure that we can control all potential alternative explanation, which again is much harder than we found. If we argue that states will behave in the international system because they seek more power, we also need to account for the fact it's possible that there are, as we said, alternative explanation. Maybe states behave in some way in the international system, not because they seek for more power, but because they have economic problems. Maybe there is some kind of a religious belief that guide the leaders. We have to make sure that we account for all those alternative explanations as we drive forward our main explanation, if we follow the realist theory of seeking power. And it's very hard to identify and make sure that we account for all those alternative explanations. So essentially, that leads again to the conclusion that I talked about earlier. Social sciences is much harder in many cases than it looks like. All right. A third factor for judging theories is falsifiability. When we test a theory, we should be able, and this is a very important principle we have to think about, we have to remember. When we test a theory, we should be able to state the conditions when the prediction of our theory are wrong. Not necessarily when the prediction of our theory are correct, but actually when does our theory does not predict what's going to happen. If we cannot come up with those conditions, then we cannot do what's called falsify our theory, which puts in question its scientific faith. And this is one of the most important principles of the scientific method that was proposed a long time ago by by scholars. And let's take an example in order to understand that. Let's think about religious beliefs. It is not possible to specify the conditions under which the existence of God, any God for that matter, doesn't matter what your religious belief is, we cannot specify the conditions where the existence of God is true or false. We cannot specify when is it true that there is a God, or we cannot specify when is it true that there is no God. Which means that this is not a theory, it's just a belief. Some people believe there is a God, some people don't believe there is a God. Right? And if we want to look at, some people will say that, yes, well, there was a dam, but there was a lot of damages in the dam, and eventually the dam did not break and everybody was safe. And this is a proof that there is a God. This is not a proof. This is a case. This is what we talked about, data that happened, that allow us to test our theory. Our theory needs to be able to specify what are the conditions when there is a God, and then we can take the problems with the dam, and then the flood, and then the big fire that happened, and test with those cases whether our conditions for there is a God and there is no God are true. Since we cannot specify those conditions, whether there is a God or there isn't a God, then religious belief are what they are, belief, and just what we believe, and not necessarily something we can test. Let's take a more relevant example to our discussion, and that's let's talk about the research on terrorism. In the terrorism research, there are some scholars that suggest that the extent of the group lethality, which is how many casualties the group is able to create, depends on the level of competition between different terror groups. And the argument in this case is that when there's more competition between groups, then they tend to take more risky types of actions, risky types of operation, and that leads to more victims. If we take as an example, a lot of groups are operating in Syria, which is relatively, for number of groups to operate there, is not that big of an area. So those groups are trying to stand out from other groups, so they will take more risky action in order to stand out, and those risky actions will lead to more victims. At the same time, there's a competing explanation in this literature that argues that when groups cooperate with one another, they actually create more damages. They create more casualties. They're more lethal. Why? Because they're able to share capabilities and share techniques. again, if we look at the example of Syria, groups that operate together are able to execute any types of operations that they're doing, leading to more casualties. Now, regardless of the case we're talking about here, the end result of those two arguments is that we have two competing arguments that both of them lead to the same outcomes. Whether terror groups cooperate with one another or whether terror groups compete with one another, we're going to end up with more victims. So whether the evidence we get, if, for our example, if the evidence we get from Syria shows that there is more competition or there's more cooperation, it's still going to lead to the same outcome, more victims. We cannot falsify this type of theory, right? Now, do you want to ask how do we solve that? Well, one solution is to look at lower level of cases or to unpack our case of inquiry. For example, there's a study from 2014 that specifies the conditions that explains how cooperation is going to lead to more casualties. It doesn't just argue that more cooperation because shared capabilities and shared techniques is going to lead to more casualties. It specifies a very clear set of conditions that explain why, when there's more cooperation between terror groups, is going to lead to more casualties. All right, so that's the idea of falsifiability. All right, our final point in the assessment of competing explanation or assessment of theories is that we are testing different explanations. And what we want to show is that our theory will outperform any type of other explanation. One of the things that helps us to think about that specific criteria is what's called the first principle of wind walking. According to that idea is that a theory will prevail as long as it outperforms others. If a more accurate explanation emerges, then it is likely to supplant the existing theory, which sounds pretty simple, right? But in reality, it's not that easy because it's much harder. The switch from the existing explanation to a new explanation is very hard to implement. First of all, the new explanation, the new theory, if we're proposing a new theory, we need to accumulate a large amount of evidence showing that our explanation is better than the existing one. Okay? The principle of wind walking is one of very intuitive reason. Even if we learn of a new, potentially new alternative explanation, it does not convince us to adopt it, mostly because we tend to focus on the costs and the risks that are associated with this change. Think about it in the context of negotiations. When we're going into talking about negotiations with somebody about some kind of problem that we have, there's some things we already have in our side. If there's a new option that is being offered to solve that problem that we're facing, it's very hard for us to accept that new offer because in many cases that means we're going to have to not accept the thing that we already have been able to establish in the negotiation thus far. So when the switching is very, very costly, then the probability of making that switch for a new explanation, for a new alternative, is very, very low. Now, based on that principle of wind walking, we can see why a lot of the behavior in the international system is predictable, because giving up on our beliefs is very, very costly. So in many cases, we will just reject alternative explanations, or when it comes to policymaking, we will reject alternative ways of behavior. Let's think about it as an example again. Look at the example with counterterrorism research. In the field of counterterrorism, trying to prevent individuals from engaging in terrorism, one of the most powerful tools that has been established is against further radicalization, is convincing those perpetrators, those radicals, that there are other ways to accomplish their goals or making true to their beliefs. So if they have any kind of demands, political, economic, social, whatever those demands are, and they think that the best way to accomplish or to fulfill those demands is by using violence, we're trying to convince them that there's other ways that they can accomplish their demands. However, when those beliefs of those individuals are engraved in religious beliefs, or they're based on years of discrimination, whatever kind, political, social, economic, again, religious, whatever discrimination is the basis for their demands, then for those individuals, for the perpetrators of terrorism, making that change and moving from the path of violence to a path of nonviolence, for that matter, is very costly for them, and it's not very likely. the end result is if we're using the methods of persuasion and convincing radicals to switch their method of pursuing their goals, it's not very likely to be successful if this is the only kind of strategy we're using. So again, shifting our belief or our behavior from one way to another is very, very hard in that case. This is a principle which is also very, very dominant among policymakers. A lot of leaders tend to hold on to their beliefs for much too long until they make this actual switch and adopt a different interpretation of reality or a different path of behavior. On the one hand, it leads to two things. It makes the behavior very, very predictable, and at the same time, it also leads, in many cases, to non-efficient outcomes in terms of actually deriving positive policies. Let's take an example also from the international relations area and talk about President Reagan SDI initiative, what was called Star Wars way back in 1980. SDI is an acronym for Strategic Defense Initiative. At the time, to counter the threat of a nuclear attack by the Soviet Union, the government has came up with the SDI plan, which was intended to provide active defense. The idea behind that was using all kinds of satellite and aerospace technology. This initiative will allow the United States to intercept nuclear missiles that coming from the Soviet Union while they are in the air, and prevent them from targeting American countries or any kind of American targets. And once this initiative was intended to replace the existing or the common strategy at the time from the beginning of the Cold War all the way to the 1980s, which was what was called MAD, which was MAD is an acronym from Mutual Assured Destruction. Since relatively early in the Cold War, one of the reasons that nuclear weapons were not used was that both of the big countries, the United States and the Soviet Union, both of them actually followed that MAD strategy. The idea behind the MAD strategy is that both of the countries had what was called a second strike capabilities. So the idea behind a second strike capabilities is that if the United States, for some reason, decided to launch nuclear weapons against the Soviet Union, the Soviets also had the capability to respond and retaliate even after being attacked by nuclear weapons using nuclear submarines or missiles that are being hidden elsewhere. So even if Moscow is destroyed by an attack from the United States, the Russians still can use their nuclear submarines to retaliate and send nuclear missiles against the United States, and vice versa. So the idea behind that this second strike capability creates incentive for both sides, the Americans and the Soviets for that matter, not to use nuclear weapons as part of their disputes. And that strategy has been in place in between both countries ever since the 1950s, all the way till this initiative was actually presented. Because SDI, in this case, this Star Wars initiative, represents a sharp deviation because it removes the idea of assured destruction. Because if the United States has the capability to destroy the Russian missiles, whenever they are fired from, then the US can, again, for some reason, whatever the reason is, fire its nuclear missiles, destroy Moscow and all the Russian cities. And even if the Russians are able to retaliate and try to fire their own missiles back, the SDI is intended to take care of that. Mostly what it did is that it made nuclear deterrence less powerful and therefore essentially better. Getting all that, coming back to our discussion about testing potential explanation, or in this case, competing policies, the potential risk that members in the Reagan administration and overall in the United States government saw from the SDI policy were much too great, and it was rejected. It was high level of uncertainty against how the Russians are going to react to this kind of initiative. Most of them preferred to stay with what they already knew at the time, the mutual assured destruction. And there was a lot of other also reasons that led to the United States not to accept the SDI initiative. But this is just as an example to show you how even when there's alternatives policies that are being offered, in many cases, they will be rejected because it's very hard to move away from what we already know that is working. Okay, so I talked about a lot of the principles that we use in order to judge or to evaluate our theories. But the final question that I want to address today is, how do we do that in practice? How do we actually evaluate or judge our theories? When we want to assess a theoretical explanation, we use evidence, we use cases. It is common to evaluate the empirical usefulness of a theory by presenting one or multiple cases that are consistent with our predictions. Case studies that rely on a single event are useful for developing ideas about a certain phenomena or to explain a specific case. So for example, if we're studying the Vietnam War, we can explain this specific conflict. Studying the Vietnam War can also provide us with some ideas about studying proxy wars, studying Cold War conflicts, studying insurgencies, and others. So what I'm actually presenting to you right now is what's called the inductive method of research. We're focusing on a specific case, and we're looking at the insights of that specific case and trying to generalize that to a wider class of cases. And this is essentially the opposite of deduction. If you remember at the beginning of the lecture today, I talked about the fact that in many cases, we're trying to build a deductive theory, a general theory that we can apply to specific cases. So in that case, the opposite for studying the Vietnam War will be to derive a general theory about proxy wars and then test one specific case of proxy wars, in this case, the Vietnam War, right? So deductive logic is the opposite of an inductive method, which is another method that is being used in scientific research. Now, coming back to this single case explanations, if we want to provide a stronger support for our theory, or we want to conduct a more robust test, we need more than just a single case. Social sciences theory, in most cases, are relied on probabilistic predictions. So when we're studying if a war is going to happen, I'm not going to say a war is going to happen or a war is not going to happen. We're saying a war is likely to happen. There's a probability of 55%, 60%, 22%, 84% that the war is going to start. We're looking at probabilistic prediction. Now, if we want to make a thorough assessment of our predictions, a single case is not enough. Making a probabilistic assessment, then testing that assessment with one or two cases is not enough. Because by design, when we're using probabilistic assessment, some of the outcomes are mixed. In some cases, we're going to have wars. In some cases, we're not going to have wars. That's how we are basing our propositions on probabilities. So essentially what it means is that we need a lot more evidence, a lot more cases in order to be more confident in the theory that we propose. If we're proposing that a certain set of conditions is going to lead to a 60% probability of a war as an outcome, we want to have as much cases as possible to test that proposition so we can have more confidence in our theoretical explanation. The selection of those relevant cases is an important task in this case, and it's not an easy task to do. Because if we want to use, for example, both world wars as cases, so we can argue that the cause for war in this case is an arms race, because both in World War I and World War II, before the war began, there was an arms race between the different countries that participated. So in this case, we can suggest that arms race lead to war. However, there's a lot of examples of wars that happened that did not follow an arms race. So if I'm arguing that my theory is that arms race are going to lead to war, and my cases to test my theory and to show that my theory is the correct one are World War I and World War II, what I'm actually engaging in is what's called selection bias. Selection bias occurs when we select cases to support our theory, but we only select the cases that are consistent with the theory, but we ignore the cases that are not consistent with our theory. Remember when I said one of the most important principles of testing theories is that we need to be able to falsify a theory. If you're unable to falsify a theory, it's not a theory, it's a belief. One reason why this is a problem is that when we're focusing on a single case, or in this case, two cases, World War I and World War II, we did not test for any type of variation in our dependent variable because, as I said, the theory was arms races lead to wars. But if I'm using only World War I and World War II, then in both cases, my dependent variable was war. War happened. We don't have cases in which war did not happen. So there's no variation in my dependent variable. So that means that this is a lot harder to use those kinds of cases in order to build an explanation for the causes of war. I have to use a lot more cases that some of them also show that arms race did not lead to war. All right, so to finish up for today, it's a little longer than the most of the lectures I'm going to have for the semester. We talked about the construction of theories overall, and specifically in the context of international relations. We have a lot of events taking place in the international system, and we can also come up with multiple potential explanations for these events. And the main challenge that we're facing when we think about research in IR is to evaluate those competing arguments and find the ones that offer both a logical explanation to the events as well as predicting similar events in the future. This is how we derive a theory, because if we just provide an explanation to any kind of war, any kind of negotiation, provision of foreign aid, then we're just providing an explanation. We cannot predict how likely it is that this kind of event is similar event is going to happen also in the future. So what we're doing is, by following the rules of the scientific method, we actually have a very clear set of tools that allow us to evaluate those explanations and test for their strength. Okay, so as I said, this is the last slide for today. These are recommended readings on those topics. On Wednesday, I will talk more about the idea of theories in the context of IR. And with that, reminding you one more time, don't forget the attendance word of today. And I will see you all on Wednesday. See you, everyone.